Side proposition's ignorance of the reality of today's debates is a crime against humanity. The reality, ladies and gentlemen, the majority of Somalian refugees moving into Kenya are most likely going to be prone to violence enacted upon them. The reality that making this a legal prosecutable offense have so much repercussions on the international community and the way states operate themselves, it's just going to be harmful. Ladies and gentlemen, the team line that side opposition brings to you in today's debates is that preventing the strong from helping the weak and preventing the weak from helping themselves is nothing but harmful in today's debate. Before I go into my positive matter, telling you why this shouldn't be a legal obligation, and expanding on the analysis and telling you why this is just going to hurt the poorest, the most weak, and the weak and the most vulnerable, I'd like to give some rebuttal. First of all, in terms of contextual matters, we don't exactly know what their policy in today's debate is, because we firstly hear from side proposition that these countries will have the ability to reallocate them to other countries, which we say they're just denying the weak the opportunity to live a successful life, because all they're going to do is play the exact role of Australia and send these individuals to countries like Indonesia, to countries like Papua New Guinea, where they were going to fester in slums. They're doing the exact same thing, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, which is what we think is most likely their policy in today's debate, they're going to force these countries to accept these individuals. They're going to force these countries to integrate these individuals to society, to which we're going to show is nothing but harmful and is going to create social tensions, which we think is going to be something that's bad. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, side proposition have failed to engage with the reality that alternatives do exist. That in the wake of a global problem like a refugee crisis, which affects every country in the world, we inside opposition believe it's responsibility of more powerful organizations like the United Nations, which controls things like the United Nations Human Rights Commission for Refugees, which controls things like the United Nations Workers' Relief Agency, to take charge of this problem. And we tell you that most nations throughout the entire world holistically should do this. This is the responsibility I'm going to address my first point. But thirdly, we need to evaluate what this debate is actually about. Because we're perfectly happy with these countries accepting these refugees. We're perfectly with them doing this on their own accord. The question to ask then, ladies and gentlemen, is it worth making it a legal, prosecutable offense to force these countries to accept these refugees, and if they don't, you're going to punish them and tell them to committed a crime against humanity? Why isn't that true? Why does my matter respond and clash directly with all of their analysis? So without further ado, I'm going to go to my first point of positive matter, because it directly clashes with the matter presented to us by side proposition. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that international law exists to regulate the conduct of states within the international community, to interact, to maintain how they interact and how they influence each other. Under status quo, there's no existing law which says that you as a country have to legally accept asylum seekers to your country. This rebuts all of the analysis that they gave to us as to why these countries have an obligation. We tell you first, country's obligation is directly to the law that exists within that society. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, a country's direct obligation is to its people. A country's obligation is first to its people, and we tell you with each individual asylum case, a country has to weigh up the subjective value of admitting these people into the country and the benefits and harms that they can accrue from this. So when side proposition tells you that these countries have an obligation to accept these people out of basic humanity and morality, we tell you that every single asylum case is different. Every single asylum case is different, which is why these countries need to judge the circumstances of these people and decide whether or not they can accept them within society or not. This makes their obligation analysis completely moot, because it deals with the periphery of these arguments and airy-fairy analysis, but didn't fail to address the core. But ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the reason why this is true and the reason why these countries have these obligations is because in reality, countries can't accept everyone. Under proposition's model, we hear that every single person that applies for asylum is going to be accepted into these countries. So we have to ask ourselves, and realistically, is this true? Is it possible for every country to accept every single asylum seeker when there are hundreds and thousands of billions that exist within these countries? Because the problem of that, ladies and gentlemen, is it firstly means that countries have a lessened ability to enact their sovereign claims. So sovereignty, and the reason we respect sovereignty of countries is because it allows countries to plan, it allows countries to protect their borders, it allows countries to take care of the people within their borders, which is something that you directly harm by instituting this policy. But secondly, the reason why we think we respect this is because we allow countries to determine to what extent they can deal with this influx of people. If you start the trend of millions of people moving across borders without those borders meaning absolutely anything, we mean it has an absolute horrible effect on the global community and their ability to regulate how people move. But ladies and gentlemen, the reason why this is so important, we tell you that there are alternatives. Because side proposition need to present to us as to why there's a pressing need for these asylum seekers to be accepted to this country. Why this is the only solution that we have in this situation, and we tell you that it isn't. In my introduction, I already characterized to you about how there are already UN enacted programs that exist to help these people. But secondly, why their obligation analysis just doesn't exist is because we tell you that these aren't the citizens of these countries. Because let's look at the situation. If you're a refugee, you currently don't belong to any country. You currently don't belong to any country that operates within the global spheres of influence. So, by that logic, we tell you that international organizations like the UN are more responsible for your well-being. International organizations like the UN, which tries to unite all of the countries of the world, are realistically responsible for making sure that this problem can be dealt with in the most encompassing way, which is something they're doing. They're establishing safe zones in these countries because they need to tell us and characterize why these people had to urgently leave these countries, to which we tell you they don't. In Syria, there are safe zones where refugees are currently being kept and looked after. In countries like Somalia, there are safe zones and refugee camps where we think these people can be cared for and are not just going to be left in asylum countries to fend for themselves, which is something that is important. So already, we understand these countries don't have an obligation to these people because we know that it's going to harm the international community and we know that there are alternatives that exist. But the real analysis we need to engage with in today's debate is why this is going to make the situation worse for these individuals, why it's going to significantly harm them, meaning that all the benefits they thought they could accrue are completely moot. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you the reason why asylum seekers aren't being accepted in the status quo is this growing resentment for people immigrating to countries. Parties like UKIP in Europe are able to win Eurozone elections and European Union elections because they're able to positively politicize this issue and win that issue. Leaders like Tony Abbott are specifically winning ticket issues like this by telling conservative Australians that they're not going to accept people in this situation. But the specific harm that we create in the situation is we recognize that we are on a trend of slowly accepting these people, but what they do is retard all of the progress that we currently have. In how many ways? One, they confirm the fears of the people in this country. So if their leaders have painted these immigration officials, or these asylum seekers, as people who are going to come into their country, steal all their jobs and just make matters worse, we tell you we confirm their fears because now there's a growing reason for them to fear them. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, this changes fast, it's very quick. So we think it's very scary for an Australian individual to live in a country when you know that soon and immediately an influx of asylum seekers are going to come to your country, and I'll take you in a moment, you're asking in unprotected time, and we think that's something that's really harmful. Tell me where I'm wrong. Okay, never mind. Clearly I don't have an adequate understanding of AWSDC rules. But lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you confirmation bias exists when these people, individuals, are so scared of that community that when they watch TV and see these growing fears, they hear the words that make them even more scared. But what are the direct harms to these refugees? Firstly, we tell you that it means they're likely to be attacked. I already gave you my introduction about how these individuals are so targeted in countries because they're hated. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that even if they're not directly attacked, even if they're directly harmed, the immense social isolation that exists means that they're not likely to get a job. They're not likely to be integrated into society because it's very difficult for employers to hire them because there's a natural locality bias. But secondly, there's social repercussions of hiring asylum seekers. They have very little money. There's very little money for them to move up the social mobility. There's very little money for them to buy basic things like food. It's very difficult to live in these countries if you know no one. It's very difficult to live in these countries if you have no way of living in that country, if you're not familiar with the law of that country, and you don't have anyone to protect you. It's very harmful, ladies and gentlemen. It's actually morally offensive to tell this situation. The way to solve this problem is to leave them to fend for themselves, ladies and gentlemen. We make that situation worse. But thirdly, we say that this is more likely to happen if an organization like the ICC doesn't. This clashes with their arguments. Because the ICC has no credibility
President Will for his speech. To continue the case from side proposition, I'd like to invite Navesh.
Just
In a world where people from the most desperate, war-torn regions of this planet are forced to flee their country in fear of their life, when many of these individuals are people like women and children, disabled, elderly, people who couldn't stay and fight, people who had no other option, it is morally reprehensible for esteemed opposition to come up here and tell us that these people had an option and there were other alternatives. We think that's patently untrue. I'm going to look at three things that they said under three different questions. Firstly, do alternatives exist? Secondly, is this justified? And third, will it actually make it worse, and why their point actually doesn't matter? Firstly, do alternatives exist? They told us that the United Nations High Commission of Refugees exists, that there are safe zones in countries like Syria and Israel. Brilliant. Okay, so if alternatives exist and refugee allocation is already perfect, then the problem doesn't exist and this debate doesn't happen. The fact that this debate is happening assumes that there is a problem with refugee allocation that we need to deal with that already isn't being dealt with by the United Nations. Then let's deal with the second justification, that there are safe zones in these countries. He used the example of Syria. Let's take that down now. Very good. So in Syria we have an Alawite community who systemically persecutes the Sunni community. And these people use chemical weaponry on them. We are going to establish a safe zone in this country. We are going to put you there. Hopefully you don't get gas, but if you do, too bad. It's a safe zone, we can't do anything about it. That's morally reprehensible, ladies and gentlemen. For you to say that a safe zone in this country is a legitimate place for these people to stand. We think that alternatives don't exist. The fact that we are debating this prima facie assumes that there is a legitimate need for this to be dealt with. Then the justification for why international law can't do this. His first problem was that no existing law exists. Good. That's why we're debating the motion, because we want the law to exist. Second, he said that a country owes capability first to its people. Yeah, that's why the motion is also worded that it's capable countries. In other words, if you have the economic viability to do it, if you have the resources in the space, then we impose this on you. We're not unreasonably expecting you to deal with a refugee status. Then he told us that every refugee is different. This argument literally does nothing more than to say that every human being is different. What we can accept about refugees in general is that they A, had no other option of where to go, B, are in desperate situations and will die if you leave them alone, but most of the time aren't going to do much damage in your country. Even if they want to assert that these people are a security threat, firstly, the majority of human beings aren't criminals, especially if you've made an effort to flee criminal actions in your own country. But even if you were a criminal, the fact that you've made such an effort to escape and run for your life means that it's more likely that you're willing to appreciate the new life you've been given and not cause havoc in that country. On balance of probability, we think that our side takes it. Then he said, we can't take in everyone. Yes, we agree. That's the problem with status quo. That countries which do take in refugees can't take in everyone, but countries with the capability to do so don't. That's why this motion is in particular important. Finally, he told us that this will only make it worse, that there's no political will, they're likely to be attacked, and life will essentially be a living hell for these people in those countries. We have several things to say to this. This debate is about trade-offs. If under their side they say they're going to live a bad life, under our side, they're not going to have any life at all. These people already fled from conditions that were probably far worse than the conditions you wanted to paint in your country. We think that as a refugee, they would rather go to a place where they face racism than stay in a country where they were likely to die as a result of the worst atrocities we've seen visited upon humankind. And even if that's not the case, we think it's simply unreasonable to portray the majority of humanity as being racist bigots who won't understand that these people are genuinely in need of a place to stay. Like, he's literally talking about people like you and I. Reasonable people who understand the nature of the way the world works and understand that refugees aren't all evil people. That's an unfair characterization of the world. Before I go on into my arguments, I'll take one.
You can trivialize the example of safe zones as much as you want, but you still haven't shown us how a court case actively prevents refugees from violent harms, which you yourself told us can cause death.
Okay, so that's what we're going to argue now in my case. Even if you want to dispute the existence of safe zones, look, if opposition's contention is that status quo is perfect, then they have ignored two things. One, the reality of the literally thousands and thousands of asylum seekers that exist in the world. But if they contend that there are literally zero people who require this policy, then good. Our policy is a preventive measure to make sure that in future, if those people exist, then there will be a solution for them. So at the very best case, even if we take their logic, our policy still works. I'm going to talk to you about how this is going to improve conditions both for the ICC and the way we deal with refugees. Let's talk about what this does. The first thing it's likely to do is increase general awareness of the refugee situation. People in countries who don't realize that the situation exists now are likely to recognize it. This means better protection for the refugees, and more importantly, the calculus of the refugees now changes. Where previously, the very refugees they wanted to talk about, who were in terrible conditions that were existing, but chose to stay there because they were scared to make the trade-off between going to a possibly safer country under the calculus that they might be rejected and have no place to stay, these people now have a guarantee that they do have a place to go to, that there is a safe zone waiting for them. We make it more likely that there are less deaths in the long term. But more importantly, this is the ICC setting new moral standards. The ICC is high time that they no longer simply work on prosecution, but protection. We think that if their side wants to contend that this is subject to public policy, our side changes that. Things that are already prosecuted by the ICC, for example, crimes against humanity, other crimes against humanity, these things are not subject to public policy. You can say as much as you want, oh, my people wanted to vote for inhumane experimentation of prisoners on death row. The ICC doesn't allow that, so that's not subject to public policy. Making the argument that the people don't want to have these refugees in is not an argument to say that it shouldn't be done. It's an argument to say that the ICC needs to step in and make sure that you recognize the collective morality that you owe to the world by virtue of being, if nothing else, a global citizen of the world with a capacity to help that chose not to do so. More importantly, this means better cooperation with the ICC, especially in the winning over of war-torn zones. If the ICC sends a message that now it is not only protecting people vastly to be seen in Western liberal democracies, but is directly targeting people in the worst off areas of the world, this means better cooperation for the ICC, especially for states that don't yet ratify the ICC. But finally, it means better allocation of refugees. How does this work? Under status quo, if I am a nation and I take in X number of refugees and fill up my quota, I am then forced to reject other refugees, but I don't know where to put them because there isn't a possibility of acceptance.